Hello and welcome to the Health Detective Podcast by Functional Diagnostic Nutrition. We bring you interviews from people who have conquered the trickiest of health challenges using the functional diagnostic nutrition philosophy and similar healing modalities. You're going to hear from experts who have been through the ringer with their health issues and yet managed to come out on the other side. You can always visit us at functionaldiagnosticnutrition.com, but for now, here is today's episode. All right, hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Health Detective Podcast by Functional Diagnostic Nutrition. My name is Evan Transu, aka Detective Ev, and I will be your host for today's show, episode number 375 of the Health Detective Podcast. And we have a repeat guest to check in with his journey and the things that he has done, which are absolutely incredible. I don't have any other announcements. I'm normally having a workshop for you guys or something that you can attend with us. I don't have any of that today. I just appreciate you being here with us. I was off last week, as you might have noticed. And so I went out and visited my buddy in Utah. So he's lived out there for 5 years. We've hiked quite a few state high points together and done other various hikes. And then I don't know if you guys have ever had that friend or family member that, God bless them, they're like super consistent and they make sure to keep inviting you and including you in stuff. And maybe you aren't the best at getting it done. Like Utah for me is just, it's a big trip. It's usually a layover. Like there's a lot that goes into making that happen. So he's moving in January. He's like, you better get out here. And I did go out for the last week. I have no idea if anyone watching right now or in the future is from that area or has been to the national parks there. Oh my goodness. As someone who grew up on the East Coast, we do have some cool views and some interesting stuff, but I've never seen certain things like that. We did Zion National Park and Bryce Canyon. So it was really, really cool. But my physical feats this last week were nothing in comparison to our guest today. So I will read his bio for those that didn't catch his first episode, and we will break this down. So Neil's kind of professional journey is he spent 20 years as a tech executive, 12 with Google specifically, leading teams to build, scale, and distribute products used by billions of people. And his personal health journey was from metabolically unhealthy and overweight to an active father and ultra endurance athlete. And we do mean an extra emphasis on the ultra side. So his motivation for what we're going to talk about today came from the pain of the realization that he could not be the active and fun father he aspired to be anymore. In parallel, far too many family and close friends were suffering from chronic diseases, be it autoimmune issues, cancer, bipolar, depression, just stuff that unfortunately we hear about all the time now. And he was reading and researching different things, and it led him to the stunning realization that metabolic health is the root cause for all chronic diseases. This coupled with the fact that 88% of people are metabolically unhealthy, 88%, isn't that? It's just crazy. And 60% of normal weight people have issues. It made him realize the true magnitude of the problem. So he had a head versus heart battle, which ensued whether to stay in the tech and the tech space that he was in or move into the health space until he had an epiphany. Epiphany/searing moment of clarity, He's always found crazy goals bring true focus and perspective that they do. So a new mission was born, help 1 billion plus people become metabolically healthy. Neil, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Ev. Delighted to be back and share some of my recent, some might say crazy antics.
Yeah, so I have been a bit elusive here. If they haven't heard your episode originally, then they don't know what we're talking about necessarily. So let's break down what challenge we're talking about, the why for it, and just remind people what you were doing here.
Yeah, of course. So the challenge was a ultra endurance swim. So 22-mile swim, which ended up taking 12 hours. But to do so, and in open water in the nice fresh Scottish lochs or lakes, but to do so totally fasted, so 0 calories consumed, just to do that using water and electrolytes. So that was the challenge. The reason why, 2 reasons. Firstly, to really try to break the paradigm that sugar and carbohydrates are needed for athletic endeavor. It really is the prevailing paradigm. But from an evolutionary perspective, our bodies actually preferentially burn fat as fuel, but in our carbohydrate-fueled environment, our bodies forget how to do that. So this really was a true demonstration from a very low-carb diet, no carbohydrates in my body. Can you go and swim for 12 hours, 22 miles, and can the body handle and cope with that? So that was one aspect of it. The second aspect was really to raise awareness then for metabolic health, metabolic therapies, mental health, mental therapies. I did it with my brother as well. And so he suffered from depression a number of years back and found that open water swimming was one of the tools that really helped him. And so it was kind of his dream swim when he got into open water swimming that I kind of tagged along and then added the 0-calorie twist to it. And so really raising awareness for metabolic health, metabolic therapy. We had a bunch of amazing charities we were raising funds for, and just to try and make people stop and think before they take a granola bar or an energy gel just to go to the gym for half an hour workout. So for athletic endeavor is one thing, but it also translates into real life. How are we powering our mitochondria and optimizing the energy to try and give us our happiest, healthiest life?
It's interesting. There's this guy, Dr. Jack Kruse, and he talked about this. I read this years ago. He actually said it. He's like, I don't think we've truly seen the first fat adapted athletes yet. And when he said like fat adapted, he didn't mean like even in keto. He just meant like really their body is primed for this now. And I think we are starting to see that, right? With this, like the fact that you did that is insane compared to what most people are able to comprehend. And as we get more and more athletes that are on board with this, I do think we're going to see some feats that we just never thought were possible before. I also want to mention this. This is actually a compliment. It's not a poke at your brother. If I remember correctly from the posts, he did end up having to consume some calories or something, right?
Yeah, he did. So the plan was for both of us to do it fasted. My brother, he's got 2 young kids, family commitments. So his training wasn't really going to plan. He was struggling a little bit with the training. And for him, we always agreed doing the swim was most important. So he needed to remove some variables because you do truly have to, to become truly fat adapted, as you say, you've really got to take 2 steps backwards to take 3 steps forward. So there's a delicate balance there, and yeah, we were under kind of time pressure. So he did end up taking calories, to do the swim, but it was at least a conscious decision. But the most important thing for him was to complete the swim, which he did.
Which is good. And the reason I'm saying that is, one, for accuracy of information, but 2, to let people know it's amazing when we strive for these things, but we also have to keep in perspective what we were doing is amazing anyway. And so I've had these things in my life where I actually probably hurt myself by saying, oh, I just need to do this because this is what I set out to do, without realizing or listening to my body and saying, no, right now I need this. And what I'm doing is still pretty damn cool. It's like if you're doing a cold plunge in very cold water, let's say like 33, 34 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're like, oh, I wanted to do 2 minutes and I only did 30 seconds. It's like, bro, you did something that 99% of people will never even attempt to do. So you got to give yourself credit where it's due. But I just wanted people to know that, because I think it's good to hear that, hey, you did this in the way that you intended. And then for your brother, he had to adjust, which both answers were smart, right? You did what you were capable of doing at that time. He did the smartest thing for his body at this time, because let's be honest, there'd be a little bit of an irony here if you guys set out for this challenge and one of you doesn't freaking make it. That's not going to be good for our health community here. We need to make sure you both get over the finish line.
Exactly. As long as we did so healthily, which we both did, even though we'll get into this later. Some might say the levels to which my blood glucose dropped to, a little teaser, some people might say are dangerously low, but I swam 12 hours, burnt 9,632 calories, and felt like I could get out of this. My arms were pretty tired, but I felt I could get out and go, run a half marathon. I still had just an abundance of energy at the end.
So let's break this down now, because I want to talk about the data that you got from this, which is so relevant to a show like this. And for those listening that are kind of used to our normal programming, if you will, about, hey, how did you overcome this chronic disease? Remember, Neil already had health issues. And so you guys can listen to that on the first episode. Just type in his name and Health Detective Podcast or FDN, either will work. But I like to bring on people that are now doing this kind of stuff too, because I think this is a common theme in the health space, not necessarily a common theme of having the goals that you certainly have, Neil, but we go from being super sick, and then thank God we are able to figure out the things necessary to get healthy. And then we want to take it to this new level of how do we optimize? And I don't want to put labels on it that aren't 100% accurate, but I would almost say what I just listed off is kind of the difference between functional medicine and the biohacking space, or at least who gets attracted to those things. Like functional medicine you get into because you're so damn sick. There are aspects of that in biohacking for sure, but I find at the biohacking conferences that we go to for FDN, you see an overrepresentation of entrepreneurs, high performers, executives. They're people looking to get the most out of their body, and there's a time and place for both. So what did you learn on the data? Was this a good thing to be doing? I can't wait to see what your blood glucose dropped down to. Let us know the whole thing.
Yeah, the whole thing. So firstly, I would say, is this a good thing for the body? First thing, just irrespective of data. So I wore CGM, I did blood tests before, afterwards, also waiting for microbiome tests. So I did as much testing as I feasibly could. But I think the first thing is back to how are you feeling internally? And so from that perspective, as I alluded to earlier, once your body gets into the metabolic state of utilizing fat as fuel, the feeling is like you're an electric car, but you have unlimited range. So you can just actually just keep going and keep going and keep going. So yes, 12 hours swimming, my arms were pretty tired by the end of it, but after that, I didn't feel massively hungry. Your body just gets into this kind of homeostasis. So I think that's the first thing. At no point throughout the swim did I, feel like I was in danger or anything. I just felt totally natural on this kind of homeostasis, even keel. So I think that's the most important thing. Some of the fascinating data that came from it, I think the first one really is I was wearing a continuous glucose monitor. And what that showed was what I expected, which is largely, you start out at a base level, which for me is around 90, 100. It was actually a little bit higher on challenge day. I'll come to that secondary because it was one of the other big learnings from tracking my bloods across all of this. Generally, everybody always gets a small bump first because the body always looks to mobilize glucose first, because glucose in the blood, glucose in the cells, it's actually toxic to our body. So you'll always get a bump as the body kind of tests how much glucose have I got in store. It's almost like it's testing your glucose tank. Once it realizes there's not much glucose in there, then slowly your glucose will drop down to gluconeogenesis, especially if fasting, and then kind of remain flat. So that generally was the shape of my CGM profile. What was really fascinating, though, is the first 6 hours, it kind of dropped down, but it would drop significantly every time I stopped to take on water and electrolytes. And by the time we got to the second 6 hours, it was almost metronomic in terms of it would lock in at around 55 milligrams per deciliter as I was swimming. And that would literally, it would almost be, constant give or take for that. And then when I would stop, it would drop down to 40, sometimes below 40. And Levels, who very kindly provided me the CGM through the Dexcom G7, it just says below 40. It doesn't register any values beneath that. So it would drop down to 40 when I stopped, and then it would go straight back up as I started, and it would lock in then at 55 for the next 55 minutes, hour that we were swimming, and then it would drop down again. So I found that fascinating. One, I wasn't expecting my blood glucose levels to go that low. Secondly, it was just how my body was feeling at the time. So either the body down-regulates, is just so sensitive to glucose that it just down-regulated because my organs needed less, or some of the other theories behind this, it could be that obviously when your muscles are working, lactate is a byproduct, and lactate can be then used as in the gluconeogenesis pathway. So it could just be there was less lactate available if you're not exercising, therefore to convert into glucose. Irrespective, for me, what was fascinating is even at that level, I felt perfectly normal, in my breaks, and literally I wouldn't have known my glucose levels were that low had I not been wearing the CGM.
I think, especially if someone's like listening to our show for the first time, or rather getting into this space, and they happen to have stumbled across this, which would be very interesting, that's for sure, then the numbers can sound nuts, but you guys got to understand something, because I would have loved to know what your ketone levels were, because when you do get fat adapted, and when your body is able to utilize ketones as energy, which, I mean, pretty much by definition, your body had to be able to have done that. You would not have been able to make the swim and do it the way that you did do it if you were just a normal athlete, right?
Correct.
So ideally, what is happening is the ketones are going up and the blood sugar stays like steady or goes a little lower. In fact, if both were excessively high, that's a medical thing, right? That's not good. That's what can happen to certain diabetics, because they can get off the charts and off the reins with their insulin being all messed up and they're pumping it artificially. So in theory, if they don't eat a lot, they could have these high ketones and high blood sugar at the same time. And it's very dangerous. It could, in extreme cases, be fatal. So we want to have that, but we're not taught that. And so, and not to mention the medical industry is really, I wouldn't say that they're not taught that like ketones exist, because again, you have things like diabetic ketoacidosis, but the bottom line is they don't understand it very well because it's not in their training. So I remember this was earlier in my health journey, like I would do these experiments, but then I would also still have problems at the same time. So I had this very severe stomach pain for a while, Neil, and I learned about fasting, and I had become mostly fat adapted at that time. So when I was in the hospital for this pain, it was so severe actually. And I figured, all right, I'm on liquids, I'm on, electrolytes, I'm in a hospital. I'm not worried at all about fasting in excess, quote unquote, here. I might as well give it a shot. And it was the first time it wasn't 72 hours, it was 62 hours. So it was the first time I basically ever did a 2-day plus water fast. And they were taking me in for like these, what do you call it? Endoscopy and colonoscopy. I had back-to-back days of this stuff. And one of the times when they're doing your vitals beforehand, the woman got very worried because my blood glucose was only at 55. Now, I felt great, and I had been fasting for about, 57, 58 hours at that point, but they're so worried that they pumped me with glucose before the colonoscopy, right? So they're not trained on this stuff.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with all of that. I think there's two important things you raised. Firstly, for listeners who are joining first time, didn't get the previous one, I trained significantly for this. I mean, it's a 22-mile swim and fasted. So yes, I did a lot of training. I was on a very low carbohydrate diet, specifically to make sure that my body and my muscles were truly adapted to utilizing fat as a fuel source. It's not something that you can just instantly turn on, I would say, overnight. It is, from my perspective, the default energy system within the body. But it's almost like as soon as you put carbohydrates in, the body realizes that it tests the fuel tank. And if you're not running, let's say, with very little carbohydrates, then it will always utilize that, because back to glucose being largely toxic in the blood and in the cells at too high levels. I think the second thing is I did actually take some ketone measurements. I couldn't take, throughout. So before and afterwards, when I did a keto mojo test, before I started the swim, this was 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. So my ketone level was at just at 0.5, so in the range of, I'd say, nutritional ketosis. Throughout the swim, it was a bit difficult to do finger prick blood tests, but I did have a Keto Air device, which is a relatively new device that Keto Air have launched. So it's an acetone breath device. So I think on 8 of the 12 stops, we managed to align to be able to do, and what you see is my ketone acetone levels going from 6 ppm in hour 2 up to 33 ppm hours, kind of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then it stayed pretty constant around 33. And then I did a keto mojo test right soon after I'd finished, within 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. And for that, my ketone levels were up at 5.2 millimoles per liter, which is,
5.2?
5.2.
Sorry to pay off. Wow. Okay.
5.2, which again, back to, I mean, for me, anywhere range between kind of, 1 and 2, 2.5, I find is generally at least optimal in normal day. But obviously when you're doing something extreme, and the purpose of the swim wasn't that everybody should go and do this, back to the principle, which is you don't need sugar and carbohydrates to fuel athletic endeavor. Mm-hmm. And to realize your body has these two fuel sources, and the ideal is if you're metabolic flexible, able to use both. You can use fat as fuel, but you can also use glucose if you need to, but predominantly, use fat. So yeah, my ketone levels were pretty high at the end, but I was 27 hours fasted in total, because my last thing I consumed was dinner at around 4 p.m., the previous day. And so, yeah, by then, and 12 hours swimming, the body was, and that's back to how the brain feels. I don't know about you, but for me, whenever my ketone levels are, high, my brain just feels like it's a different brain. It's functioning at a different level. And so the clarity that you get through that is also just pretty amazing. It's a great metabolic state to be in my opinion.
It's really nuts. I actually did a whole presentation on this for FDN at a conference one time, where we were talking about our body basically being inflamed and how that can actually manifest as mental health symptoms for many people. Not to go off the rails with it, but guys, look this up. It's kind of crazy. There was a meta-analysis done showing the efficacy of things like turmeric and omega-3s for mental health. And you're like, oh, okay, that's sure. We already know that. But then it also showed the efficacy of like Advil and naproxen. Now, I'm not recommending those medications, but you have to think about that. Why on earth would an Advil improve people's depressive or anxious or anxiety symptoms for a short period of time? And it seems to be a result from the lack of inflammation. Now, can we do that naturally? Yes. And ketosis is one of the ways. So I think that I'm probably oversimplifying it, but I do believe that when we're using those ketones as fuel and having the lack of glucose, of course, too, right? We're like lowering that bodily inflammation, which is why people feel so good physically. But then also, if you do the same thing mentally, all these people are like reporting, oh, I feel clear, or I feel all this stuff. I think at least a significant fraction of that is just from lessening the inflammation. We also know that the brain, yes, it prefers glucose to some degree, but it does operate fairly well on ketones also. So it's kind of interesting to see that happen for people. But yeah, I mean, some of the times I was doing keto so religiously for a while. I'm now more like on and off, and I don't track as much. I might get back into it just to do some experiments. It'd be cool to do on the podcast. But I remember I got to a point where I could almost guess the number, like plus or minus zero point 0.4, let's say, based on how I felt cognitively. And I'd be like, oh yeah, no, I'm guarantee I'm sitting around 2 right now. And I would know it because I was tracking that often. So the fact that I could understand how I felt and know that that would manifest as a certain number on the tracker, it's like, yeah, there's something to it. And this is science. This part's not my opinion, that ketones absolutely can help depressive symptoms, but you don't see that getting recommended to kids. That's for damn sure.
So I wholeheartedly agree. Actually, maybe a personal insight to share back with you, which was, so I think we covered on the previous episode, my testosterone levels were chronically low back in March, and as part of then, I would say, curing that, I went on a very high protein, I would say high meat, and I was adding more carbohydrates in to help just temporarily to get the body back into balance. Mm-hmm. But that also correlated with, because of my testosterone was so low, I actually was really struggling mentally with that. And one of the aha moments for me was I had some exogenous ketones. And to tie this back to your kind of biohacking kind of FTN evolution, I had some exogenous ketones from when I was training for marathons and using both as a test. And I just took some of the exogenous ketones, and literally within 15, 20 minutes, it was like that the kind of depression lifted, and it was like I had a new brain. And that for me was just a stunning realization of the power of ketones in the brain. And that I then started more cycling on and off. So I would keep my protein, moderate, not crazy high. And I would cycle in some carbs, maybe every 10 days, every 2 weeks, just to help not put too much pressure on the hormones. I was trying to recover my testosterone levels. But I do think ketones, and the other thing is back to, yes, the brain needs glucose. All of the organs need glucose. But one of the other things I wanted to prove in my swim is your body is capable of producing all of the glucose that your brain and your organs need. And so, any carbohydrates you put in your body aren't necessarily required. And so I think that's just another example. My brain was, operating perfectly well throughout. It created the amount of glucose that it needs. But I, like you, do feel a difference and I know when my brain is running on ketones, it's a different level, and it's just this cleaner, it's just this cleaner energy and clarity that I find you get.
And just to be clear, Neil, not that we have to give a whole tutorial on it per se, but just so people know, if they went and tried to do what you did, I forget the training aspect for a second. Let's just say they went and tried to, eat super low carb or go into keto within a few days, and they've never done it before. You worded it perfectly, I thought, like 2 steps forward before you go, or 2 steps back before you go 2 steps forward. And the reason for this, guys, is we almost have to reset this metabolic switch. I've heard it worded as, like, our body is going to do what we tell it to do. Our body is going to not spend the energy on things we tell it doesn't need. So it's kind of crazy. And I've seen this in many people when they're tracking. It truly becomes easier to get in ketosis over time. And I think it's not that it really becomes easier. It's that it became harder for you for a while. I think it probably was easy as a kid, especially if you look at the macronutrient content of breast milk and what that would actually mean for a baby, and the fact that they have super high or large amounts of brown fat. So how can someone kind of break into this, and what should they expect? Because, 2 steps backwards, to me, that means something in my head, but to some people, they might not understand. Like, it actually can be a little tricky in the beginning, fully getting this down. Like, how long shouldn't they feel good? Do you think they should feel bad at all? Like, how can they start getting fat adapted?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for me, the most important thing is, as you mentioned, one is the metabolic machinery and reawakening this kind of metabolic pathway within. So that takes some time. The second part of it, I think, is your microbiome. So our microbiomes adjust generally to what we take. So if you dramatically alter, your diet and what you consume overnight, then there can be some pretty, it can be more difficult to adjust. So my recommendation for the majority of people is just do it step by step, week by week, and just start by cutting your carbohydrate in half. You kind of almost each week you just cut in half, you drop down, you drop down, you drop down. And as you're doing that, be conscious about what types of carbohydrates you're eating and move towards things grown above ground instead of things grown, the starchy potatoes, rice, etc. And so if you just do the combination of that and make sure you're getting, high quality, healthy fat and adequate protein over the course of a few weeks, you will slowly transition your body, which will make it much easier. So that is, I would say, the kind of the preferential or way to do it. The challenge with that is it takes a bunch of time and it's also, difficult. I do think things like exogenous ketones people can try to see the difference that they feel with that, because I'm all for positive, feedback, because if you get instantly, see the benefit in something, you're more likely to, to stick with it.
Right.
And there were some really great books out there, I think, and there's many different approaches. I think Dr. Gundry's done a lot of amazing work about, different types of diet, how you can optimize different types of foods, for prebiotics, postbiotics, without getting into too much detail. But I'll link my 1 Billion Metabolically Healthy website again in the show notes, because I link to a bunch of these different resources in there. And I think this is also back to everyone's individual. So there's different ways to approach it. I'm trying to provide a library of things on that website that people can see, oh, actually, you know what, this might work for me. Another great way to do this, I'm a big fan of Volta Longo's fasting mimicking diet, which can be a little bit more accessible. So that's 5 days, limited calories. You get sent a box with pre-prepared foods, and that can effectively, using a combination of fasting and calorie restriction, actually is probably one of the better, the easiest ways for most people, irrespective of what your dietary preference is, to be able to flip that metabolic switch. So there's a bunch of different tools out there. It's trying to figure out which one, is best for you.
I don't shout this link out enough, but guys, I would recommend tracking your ketones. If you're going to try this, you can go to fdntraining.com/store. And we are affiliated with Keto Mojo somehow, which is great because you can actually track blood glucose on the same meter that you can track the ketones, which is very convenient for a lot of people. So fdntraining.com/store, there's probably some link there that you can check out. And I always tell people this, like, remember, I shouldn't say remember, they might not know at all. When you are attempting to become fat adapted or really giving it a shot, and like you're sitting there thinking, oh, I feel like crap or something's going on, you got to check your electrolyte levels. That's hugely important because you are going to dump electrolytes when you start getting into keto. Why? Because when you're not eating carbohydrates, you're not having as much fluid retention, and the fluid holds a lot of those electrolytes. So you're kind of dumping the stuff, and you might not feel great in the beginning, but people blame that on keto and say, oh, it's awful or whatever. The reality is you're probably not in ketosis yet. And that's why I recommend tracking. It is a rare day that I find someone that has a ketone level, of 1+, and they're like, oh, I feel like crap. It's normally the exact opposite. They'll think that they're eating keto, and maybe by definition they are, but their body hasn't fully made that switch yet that Neil and I are talking about. So the reality is they're not producing reasonable amounts of ketones. Their blood glucose is still all over the place. And then they're thinking, oh, this didn't work for me. It didn't kind of snap into it yet. So definitely check that out. Neil, before we get into, because I wanted to talk about just the belief side of this and realizing what humans are capable of, and we just have to start small and work our way up. But before that, did we miss any lab markers or metrics that you wanted to cover still?
Yeah, we did. Yeah. So I also did comprehensive blood panel testing through Cyfox. So Cyfox, I would recommend to anybody, actually, at home blood marker spot testing. You just do it from your home, you mail it in, super easy, and gives you a very comprehensive, cost-effective view of I think it's like 26 plus there's hormone panels you can do. So Cyfox very kindly gave me a bunch of tests. So I did a baseline about 10 days before the swim. I then did a blood test the morning of the swim. I did a blood test the morning after the swim. Then I did a second baseline about a week after the swim to kind of establish, to really try and see what impact the swim had on, my lipids, on my hormones, on all of my different biomarkers. So
How'd that go? Yeah, how'd that go?
yeah, how did that go? So let's just focus on the swim. I would say on the positive side, actually, there honestly wasn't any huge dramatic shifts in the swim that were concerning. Some things did change and drop. So my testosterone was one that I was particularly interested because there is a correlation between, fasting and reduced testosterone levels. And I was trying to still recover my testosterone. So even the training for this was really fine balance. So what was interesting is my testosterone did drop reasonably significantly from 3.84, I think the units are nanograms per milliliter, down to 2.47, which is a pretty significant drop. But by the 28th, a week later, my testosterone was actually up to 5.28, which is the highest level that it has been, since my kind of, beginning of this year.
Wow.
I've never managed to get higher than, I would say, the kind of the 3.28, 3.8 that I had before the swim. So that for me was interesting. It did drop down, but it rebounded very, quickly and is still kind of, going up. So that was really interesting to me that there wasn't any, long-term impact aside from that one day. So that was fascinating. I think most of the other markers then, at least around the swim, were kind of what you would expect. Triglycerides was one marker. The expectation was that and this often, you see this in the studies, it drops significantly, after event. Mine actually didn't drop. It did drop, but not very significantly. And I think the reason why is just because I truly am fat adapted, having spent months training this way. A lot of the studies tend to be shorter term fat adaptation. So I think from that perspective, the body's probably still using a little bit of both, and therefore your triglyceride levels tend to drop a little bit more. So that was a little bit of the insight behind that. Aside from that, most of the others, which we would expect, right? So my HSCRP, my inflammatory markers went from less than 1 up to 32, as you would expect, doing 12 hours of crazy swimming exercise. But within a week, they dropped back down to the 1 baseline level. So nothing overly concerning about that. And most of the others were really markers that tracked inflammation. There wasn't any huge other shifts that we could notice in my blood, at least the day of the swim. What was fascinating was actually the context around the swim. So my fasting insulin level, as you would expect on a low carbohydrate diet, was very low 2 weeks before. So it was less than 1. 2 weeks before. No, sorry, it was at 2 weeks before. The day of the swim, it was at 6.5, and the day after the swim, it was at 8.6, which you would not expect. The reason why this is I flew to the UK 6 days ahead of the swim. I flew overnight, so didn't sleep then. And I then just had 5 days of horrific sleeping in different places, no air conditioning, it was warm. So I just had 5 days of terrible sleep. And I could actually see this in my continuous glucose monitor, which tracks the fasting insulin. And I didn't change anything to do with my diet. So I was still on a very low carbohydrate diet. I wasn't particularly, stressed about the swim, although there was some element of stress and anticipation. It really was 5 nights of terrible sleep, even on a low carb diet, can, significantly increase your fasting insulin levels. And my blood glucose average went from, less than 90 to 100, I think it was 103 the day before the swim.
Okay.
So, and then 2 weeks later, as I got back home and rested, both of those, my fasting insulin was back down at, I think it was back down at 2 again. And my blood glucose was back down around 85, 90 average across the day. So that for me was just the biggest insight of, we all look at carbohydrates and sugars as the main driver, which it is behind kind of your insulin glucose, but these other things, stress, environment, sleep, toxins, all significantly play into that. And this was just a highlight to me just how important quality sleep is. And I was shocked to see it had that much impact in the space of 5 or 6 days.
Wow. Yeah, no, and I like that you brought light to that, because there are other, yes, blood sugar is not just a food thing. We know it's a light thing as well. We know that people that are exposed to artificial light have higher blood glucose levels while they're in the artificial light. They'll have better insulin responses if they eat outdoors rather than eat indoors under the artificial light. And again, not my opinion. This is all proven stuff. There's also, the FDNs will be very familiar with this, or if you're a trainee, CAR, the cortisol awakening response. When cortisol goes up and adrenaline goes up and all these hormones start pumping, that can also raise blood glucose. So it actually, I felt very naive at the time. It took me a while years ago because I'd test like my ketones like first thing in the morning or relatively close to the first thing in the morning when I was doing this, and I was all upset because my blood glucose was high, and I wasn't realizing that it was a very short period during that time that I was getting the cortisol awakening response that I was experiencing elevated blood glucose, and it's otherwise totally normal. So let's, first of all, really cool about the lab stuff. You make me want to get into this again, because what I mean by get into this is, prior to doing the podcast for FDN, I was very interested in doing these like experiments on myself, you could call them. I don't think I told you this last time. I actually, in COVID, did 60 days of camping just to see like how I would feel and what would happen, because I'm a huge light nerd. I love the circadian biology side. So I just wanted to know how I'd feel. And when the heck do you get to camp for 60 days other than the beginning of COVID, right? So I want to kind of do stuff like that again. That'd be amazing to show on our show. So thank you. Now, let's break down this, because you told me off air how many people will come up and say, oh, I don't think I could ever do something like this. And when I hear something like that, there's two ways I interpret it. There's either one, they literally do not believe that they are physically capable to achieve something like that. Or two, some people might mean it this way, even though they don't say it directly. They might believe that they don't have the discipline to achieve something physically like this. And those are kind of two separate issues in a sense, but I want to know your take on this, because you weren't starting as some super athlete. It's not like you were training since you were 5 years old, never gave it up, and now did this. You had to recover as an adult. So I hope people listen to the first episode to hear that part. But how did you overcome, I guess, the mental side of this? Because at one point when you were overweight and dealing with stuff, I'm sure it had to be a little bit intimidating to come up with an idea like this and think that you're going to do something of this nature. So where does it start? Where does the belief even come from that you could achieve something like this? And then where does someone start to move in the right direction?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I do get that quite a lot. I could never do that. And I always ask, the swim, the fasting, or both, because sometimes it's a different thing. And often it's either or both. And my response is, 10 years ago, as I said to you, when I was starting my journey, 260 pounds, the epitome of unhealth. I think, my first run, I went a few hundred meters and I had to stop because just everything hurt and my lungs hurt. I couldn't run any more than a few hundred meters. My first swim, I did 50, 60 meters, and I did swim a lot when I was younger. And I just naively thought, I'll get back into the pool. I'm sure I'll be able to go and, do 400, 500 meters, no problems. And I simply couldn't. So where does the belief come from? The belief comes from the training. And my journey was a little bit different. I never went into it thinking I'm going to do ultra endurance things. I just wanted to be a fun, fit, active father. But I realized how important accountability was to yourself. But signing up for events, I'm just a huge fan. It doesn't matter what it is, sign up for something, because it gives you that target to then map your journey and your progression along. So for me, I just started running, I started cycling, and then I was, I used to swim when I was younger. Maybe I'll just do some swimming. And then I thought, well, I'll sign up for a triathlon. So I signed up just for a sprint, which is a very short triathlon. I did that, I loved it. I did another sprint, and then I started getting longer and longer. So a lot of it is pull on that thread. I did have to get over the first 6 months of this transformation. I hated every single day of it. I would wake up in the morning and I would have this debate with myself for 10 minutes, all these excuses about I'm tired, but I made myself a promise, back to the accountability, that no matter how tired, no matter how hungover, where I was in the world traveling, I would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and I would just do something. And I would come back to that and the promise that I made my daughter. And, promises and integrity is really important value to me. And as soon as I would come to that thought, I would be out of bed and I would be doing something, going for a run. But the first 6 months, I absolutely hated it. So sometimes you need to get over that learning curve. But once you get into the positive virtuous of starting to enjoy it and see the benefit, it becomes much easier. And so I think for a lot of people, and I give a similar response to you, which is everybody is capable of doing way, way more than anybody could
Yeah.
do what I did. The question is, do you have the right motivation, firstly, to do it? And secondly, are you willing to prioritize and make the time for it? Because a lot of people say, I don't have time. I don't believe in I don't have time. It is, are you willing to make time? And it does require sacrifices, in other areas, because to train for something like an ultra endurance event, you can't just rock up and do it. You really do have to train for it. So, but if you do both of those, then you can train your body to do absolutely incredible, amazing things. The only final thing I would say is back to the swim. So I had done ultra endurance stuff. I'd done, full Ironmans before, but this was also a different one. I'd never swum probably more than 5-6 kilometers. So to go from
Okay.
that to 36 kilometers was a huge jump. Also, you predominantly use your legs in an Ironman for running and for cycling. You don't really use your arms very much. And for swimming, it's, probably 80, if not 90% is your arm. So,
Oh, I didn't realize
so even as part of this, and you add the fasting into it, I did have the periods of time throughout this where I was, am I going to be able to do this? I simply didn't know. I was also trying to balance and recover my hormones. So I wasn't doing as much fasted training as people would think, especially the longer sessions. They were fat fuel sessions. But what gave me the confidence was the training, the belief in myself. And I believe any distance that you're doing, if you can target a month before to do 80% of that distance, then that is your kind of confidence booster that, yes, when I taper off and recover on days. So about a month ahead of the swim, I did a 30-kilometer pool swim, because I live in Texas, and in the middle of summer here, there's not much open water swimming. So I just went down to the pool at 6:30 in the morning, didn't come home till 5:30 at night, and just spent 9 hours doing 30 kilometers in the pool. And I did that totally fasted. And that gave me, to your point, the confidence to know, what, I can do this. Outdoor swimming, very different, the conditions, all the rest of it. But if I can do 80% in the pool, the rest of it is down to the mental mindset that you need to have on challenge day. So yeah, I just think the confidence comes from the training and enjoying the journey along the way, having a goal and mapping towards that, not being overly wedded to the goal, because the growth and the confidence comes through the journey.
I love this. And I think I don't want to go to a separate topic, especially so late in the podcast, but this relates to business. And I'm bringing this up only because we talk about business of health coaching so much, the business of health coaching so much on this show. If you are someone who can figure out the principles necessary to achieve notable physical feats, you can do business, because what it requires is these little micro steps and disciplines over and over and over again. And also the belief. And again, I don't want to be totally off the rails with this topic, but I get so passionate about this because so many people will be like, well, I could never make a few $100,000 a year being a health coach. I could never make $1 million a year. I'm like, do you know how many people aren't even trying because they have that same belief? I mean, it's one thing if you're trying to shoot to be a billionaire. Okay, that's a separate category. I can't speak to that. But I'm like, some of this stuff isn't even hard. It's actually insultingly simple once you realize that most people aren't even trying. So when you talk about stuff like this, I think it seems so unachievable. And by the way, it's still a hell of an impressive feat. Let's be realistic about things. Anyone that's earning $1 million a year, that's insane. You're beyond the top 1% at that point. It's like $430,000 a year is top 1% of America. So it's not to say that these feats aren't insane. It's to say that so many people aren't even going to try. How many people are actually out there laying out a plan necessary to train for something like you're training for? So you beat 90% of the competition just by trying and having a plan and then executing on it regularly. So I love stuff like this for so many reasons. You wouldn't know this about me, but I got into personal development and self-help, if you will, before I got into health. They were closely linked for me, but it actually preceded that. So that's where like the mental health motivational speaker side of me comes out, because I just believe that we can do so much more than we can even comprehend. And then you hear these people at the top and they're the ones that say, oh yeah, I operate on like 20% of what I'm capable of, but they're at the top and they're flawed just like us and don't discipline themselves 24/7. I'm like, what the heck would happen to someone who actually, discipline themselves all the time? Who knows?
I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think for me, one of the best decisions I ever made as an athlete was to get a coach, because it takes all of the guesswork out of it. partly, or not all of, some of, but for me, the most important thing is it gives you that structure, the accountability, and somebody to share the journey with, because difficult change is difficult on its own. Sharing it with someone, having that accountability is so important. And I think it's no different in health. And given the Western world is set up to be counter to what we really need to put in our bodies to make our bodies thrive, I do think that we're at it's still in the early days of people realizing you need a health coach, because we're living so out of tune with our evolutionary biology that accountability and help navigate all of the minefields in every day that trigger these biological urges of stress and other things to consume things which we know are not good for us, but you just kind of sometimes can't stop yourself. I think more and more people realize that health coaches are critically important, because we only get given one life on this planet, and we've got to do the most with that.
Yes, so Neil, super impressive. We're almost at time. Two quick questions. One, where can people find you? And then two, what the heck is next for you?
Good question. So people can find me, if you want to know a little bit more about the swim, 0-2-loman.com. That's a swim website. Yeah, perfect. Thanks for putting that up. So, and we're still taking donations and awareness for the charities that we are. So if you have a read, and please, if you can, feel free to donate. The second website is my 1 billion plus metabolically healthy. So that's 1bmh.org. There you can find a ton of resources, just some basics about what metabolic health is, why it's important, and links to various different tools to help you start or continue your journey. The third place to find me is probably on LinkedIn. So if you search for Neil Gyte on LinkedIn, feel free to connect, drop me a message. I'm also on Instagram, trying to do more on Instagram, but it's not the easiest platform I find. But yeah, so Gyte Neil at Instagram. They are the best places to find and get in touch with me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. And I mean this seriously. I never say things just because we're live or I'm trying to flatter someone. It really, I think the follow-up and knowing that you were about to come on again really inspired me to say, like, okay, yeah, maybe I should be doing some more challenges here. One, because I just was happy with myself when I was doing those things. I thought it was really fascinating. And then two, I have a YouTube channel with FDN. It's like we could use this for content too. So everyone wins. I mean, maybe we get a pay raise, and then we also get to have some fun and see what we're capable of.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a big fan of signing up for something, setting yourself a challenge, because it's that excitement, and especially if you can do something a little bit out of your comfort zone and audacious, it's where you get the most personal growth, by doing something that you think, is it or is it not achievable? So, and to answer your final question, what's next?
Oh, yes.
I don't know. I agreed to do the swim. The priority after this is getting my hormones truly back into balance, because again, being really honest, I was building the swim off not a stable hormonal foundation, which I wouldn't recommend to anyone to do. Get your hormones in balance first before you layer on significant, physical activity. But we'd already committed to the swim, agreed the date, and so that was, is a difficult one. So do as I say, not as I do. So I'm really working on myself. I'm continuing to work more on strength. I've underinvested in strength, because I was really focused on Ironman and running as fast a marathon as I could. So I'm doing those right now, but there will be more challenges, metabolic challenges for sure next year. I'm probably going to use the Christmas New Year period to reflect and try and figure out what's next. So, but definitely, I think it's just a great way to make people, think a little bit and raise some awareness. So yeah, maybe we'll do a challenge together, Ev. That would be
Cool.
would be another option.
Yeah, you guys stay tuned.